Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Gas Station Live. I am your host, Saren, and with me, as always, is my co-host, German James Woods. How are you doing tonight, James?
Oh man, I'm doing wonderful. We have a very, very, very special guest with us tonight, Dr. E. Michael Jones, and our good friend Pat Exberg is here as well. How are you guys doing tonight?
Good.
Wonderful, wonderful. Pleasure to be here with Dr. Jones.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Jones. We have a few different topics we could cover here tonight. James, I understand you have a few questions that you would like to ask Dr. Jones. I will let you go ahead and take the floor if you'd like.
Absolutely. All right. So let's start. So you talk a lot about logos, and I'd like to hear your take on that in the context of Jewish identity, if you don't mind.
Yes, logos is a Greek term that emerged during the pre-Socratic era. It was means reason. They used it to refer to the order of the universe. They understood there was an order to it. And all of our words about science, biology, all come from that word. Uh, at the same time that the Greeks were coming to this on their own, the Jews were coming to, or the Hebrews were coming to an understanding of God in their way, slightly different way. God was revealing himself to the Hebrews, and they called it wisdom, the wisdom literature and wisdom, which was their basic talk about the understanding of the universe as subordinate to God. Uh, the Jews were promised a Messiah. That Messiah arrived. It was Jesus Christ. The Jews then had to exercise their free will and either accept the Messiah on his terms or reject him. The majority of the Jews rejected him. Many Jews did accept Jesus Christ as the Messiah, and they are known as Christians. We are the spiritual descendants of those Jews who accepted Jesus Christ as the Messiah. At a certain point, the Jews expelled the Christians, and the Christians, like St. Paul, had to realized we got to talk to the Greek world. We got to talk to the Greeks now. How are we going to talk? And the example was Paul going to the Areopagus and basically failing to talk to the Greeks. I think St. John, who was in Ephesus along with St. Paul, realized this failure. We need a new vocabulary, and that's when he adopted the word logos. The first four sentences of his gospel are in the beginning there was logos. Logos was with God, and logos was God. This is his way of teaching, adopting that whole Greek strategy, okay, uniting it with the Hebrew strategy, coming up with a new strategy called Christianity, and that was the new plan. Now, once you understand it in those plans, when the Jews rejected Jesus Christ, they rejected the Logos. When they rejected the Logos, they rejected the order of the universe. When they rejected the order of the universe, they became revolutionaries. And that's what they've been ever since. From the foot of the cross, whatever to wherever you want to stop, gay marriage, the Kavanaugh hearings, pornography, Israeli snipers gunning down Palestinian women and children. They have been a rebellion and logos ever since. That's the way they are today.
And now, I'd like to note as well, that is relatively what you cover in the Jewish revolutionary spirit. Is that correct?
Right. That is the premise of the Jewish revolutionary spirit. And then I cover 2,000 years explaining how that manifested itself throughout history. The conflict in history is the conflict between logos and anti-logos. And the leading force in anti-logos in history has been the Jews who rejected Jesus Christ.
Fantastic, and that is a fantastic piece of literature as well. That is a wonderful work that you have put out. And Patricksburg, I believe that you had something as well, a few things that you'd like to talk to Dr. Jones about as well.
Oh, yes, particularly about the current demographic makeup in terms of the overall world population of Catholics at this point. Now, in the last 100 years, according to Pew Research, the Catholic religion worldwide has dropped off drastically in terms of Europeans who comprise the population of the church. In 1910 and around the beginning of the last century, 65 to 70% of the world church population was comprised of Europeans. And I think in 2014, the last bit of statistical gleaning that I got from overall world population of Catholics measured Europeans at around somewhere between 23 to 20%. And this has occurred during the last century as the third world population of Catholics has actually rose quite drastically, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, when it has gone from less than 1% at the turn of the century to now comprising about 16% of the Catholic population, Asians from about 5 to 12%, and Latino Caribbean from about 24 to 39%. Even in the Middle East, though, it's still a very minute fraction of the overall Catholic population, has experienced an increase over the last century of about 280%. Now, how could somebody that is an advocate for the church expect any self-respecting European man to tether himself to a faith that is obviously more interested in missionary work in third world nations than actually appealing to the European people who founded the church itself?
Well, that's an interesting way of putting it. What you're seeing here is a large-scale defection from the church in Europe that began in the 19th century. And what you're seeing is a large-scale acceptance of the faith in Africa, where the gospel hadn't been preached up until that time. So if you're talking about the increase in Africa, it's because they responded to Logos, because we're all programmed. We're rational creatures. We naturally respond to Logos. If you're talking about the defection in Europe, we could talk about a lot of different things. We could talk about Nietzsche, a man who hated the whole idea of Logos, who hated Christ. People who wanted to, who felt that the church was an infringement upon their freedom. There are lots of different things to talk about, but we're talking about basically two separate things. And
well, I could actually pose it in a different way by reading a short quote from the Pope that was actually given in 2013. He said, "Migrants trust that they, meaning the European Western nations, will encounter acceptance in terms of their reception by the Europeans, solidarity and help, that they will be met with people who will sympathize with the distress and tragedy experienced by others, recognize the values and resources the latter have to offer, and are open to sharing humanly and materially with the needy and the disadvantaged." And that was the Pope at the, I think, World Refugee Conference. Now, this is obviously him imploring Western nations, particularly nations in Europe, to open their doors to the third world and become refugee camps, and to give up their want for any sort of ethnic homogeneity. Do you think that this might be a reason why Europeans are leaving the faith, that there doesn't seem to be from the top of the church itself a care for the European people and to appeal to them in any way?
No, I don't think that's why people are abandoning the faith. I watched it happen. I lived in Germany in the 70s. Germany was, I just finished a piece, a chapter on a book on Logos. It's also going to be an article in Culture Wars magazine. I just did a YouTube video on it, but it's the piece is called Werner Heisenberg and Jewish Science. As I said, I was in Germany during the 1970s. I watched Germany being subjected to a ruthless campaign of social engineering that was based on corrupting their sexual morals. This campaign was orchestrated by the Allies. They brought over Alfred Kinsey. They had to approve every single magazine and book that was published at this time. It was a huge campaign of social engineering. It affected the entire church, including Pope Benedict, I think. It was the same social engineering, the campaign that was unleashed against American Catholics during the same period of time. And the purpose of it was to sexualize the German population, to get them involved. It was cooked up by the Frankfurt School, the Jews involved in the Frankfurt School. It was cooked up to sexualize the occupation of the people living under the occupation. And it had a devastating effect on the sexual morality. And when it has a devastating effect on sexual morality, it has a devastating effect on church attendance. And that's, Wilhelm Reich knew this. It's in his book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism. And that is the main cause of the defection from the church during this period of time. The migration, by the time the migration crisis came along, this had been a long history of at least 50 years before the migration crisis came along. If you're asking me about migration, every country has a right to defend its borders. Okay, a country without borders is like a triangle without sides. You have to have borders and you have to be able to defend them. If you're asking me about the current wave of migration, the main cause of it is United States foreign policy. First of all, in Syria, causing huge numbers of refugees from that country. But I think more importantly, if you're talking about Black Africa, Libya. Hillary Clinton destroyed the Gaddafi government, and Libya, that was the richest country in Africa. And at that point, it became the jumping off point for migration. And this migration is, I believe, being orchestrated to destroy ethnic, the European culture of these various nations. I experienced it myself when I grew up in Philadelphia, when the Irish neighborhoods were, or the Catholic ethnic neighborhoods were ethnically cleansed by large amounts of Black migration. In Philadelphia, it was from North Carolina. In Chicago, it was from Mississippi. But this was another example of migration being orchestrated for political purposes.
Thank you so much for that answer. I had one more question, then I'll give the floor to Saren and James here. This is kind of a more personal question. Would you prefer the population of the Western world, hypothetically, to be comprised of a majority of non-European Catholics or a majority of European non-Catholics?
Is this a trick question?
No, it's a sincere question. You don't have to answer it with a yes or no or a binary.
Monsignor Knox, an English Catholic, he said, if I had to go on a walking tour, I'd prefer to go with an English Protestant rather than a Spanish Catholic. We all have cultural affinities, okay?
Oh, it was a personal question, just as your personal sensibility. Yeah.
The whole point of this migration of the Catholic Church in the United States was that it did provide a vehicle for assimilation that was successful until it was wrecked by social engineering. So all I can say about your question is it's really not about me. It's not about me. I travel all over the world. I see all different kinds of people at all different levels of whatever culture and so on and so forth. Not about me. Who cares? Who cares what I think?
Oh, I do. I think you're an interesting guy. I think you're very intelligent. I really enjoy your work. I was just interested in getting some sort of a personal perspective on the issue at hand. But no, it's fine. I'm satisfied with your answer quite thoroughly.
And if I may interject, I'd like to just go back to what you were saying about the social engineering that took place in Germany that you had witnessed during the 70s, and it coming from the Americas, as well as that being sort of an expansion of the influence of the Frankfurt School on America. Would it be safe to say in that case that much of the degeneracy that we've been seeing coming from America today, as well as what we see in Germany and all over Western nations, and on top of that, the decline in numbers in not just Catholicism among European peoples, but Christianity in general, very much comes from the Frankfurt School and thereby Jewish influence in the first place?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's actually what I'm saying. One of the Jews from the Frankfurt School were brought over by the American Jewish Committee in 1933. They were put to work on a project that came to be known as the authoritarian personality. And then when after the war ended, they got to implement their understanding of how to get rid of the authoritarian personality in Germany. Germany had no defense against it. And one of the conclusions they came to was the earlier you have engage in sexual activity, the more democratic you're going to be. So that became the plan for Germany. Let's get these kids involved in sexual activity. And so what you had here is, number one, the Kinsey report being reported in all of these magazines. And then the word report taking on a life of its own in Germany and the creation of their Schulmädchen report. Okay, 1970, which begins like all this phony-ass scientific survey, and then it ends up with a TNA softcore porn. This had a devastating effect on the people I was teaching. I was teaching kids at that age at that time. It had a devastating effect on their sexual morality. I watched it firsthand. It was all done. None of this stuff could have happened without the explicit permission of the Allied occupying forces, because every single magazine, every single publisher, director, writer, and so on and so forth had to get a license from a Jewish psychiatrist from New York City by the name of David Mordecai Levy. So it was all done. The Jews were the engineers of this program, but it was all done under the auspices of the social engineering of the occupying forces.
That's absolutely incredible stuff. Thank you very much for your take on that. Now, I do understand that you are rather short on time this evening. I do have a question as to your opinions on libertarian principles as sort of a justification for degeneracy, and thereby as well the sort of religious adherence to, say, free markets over a moral framework. I personally am incredibly opposed to libertarianism that uses sort of Enlightenment values as a justification for its beliefs, which I don't think are really, I don't think that really works together.
First of all, libertarianism is bad economics. And not only is it bad economics, read Murray Rothbard's book on money. And what you realize is he's proposing a form of money, gold. He likes gold. And what that means is the people who get the gold basically strangle the economy. It's bad economics, but it's even worse when you use this economic theory as the basis for some type of social or moral policy. It's devastating. It's absolutely stupid, and it's absolutely devastating. And the prime example of what I'm talking about here is this whole wave of conversions among homosexuals in San Francisco in the 70s to free market economics. The classic example is the Catholic priest Robert Sirico, who was a gay activist and now is parading around in a Roman collar, undermining the Catholic teaching on economics. I have no time for libertarianism as an economic theory, and I have even less time for it as a social theory.
I agree 100% on that. Yeah, I am not a fan of libertarian in the least. And James, I believe you may have had a question regarding, I think you had a question for Dr. Jones.
Yeah, absolutely. You were talking earlier, you mentioned that when you were growing up, that at some point they started moving a bunch of black people into your neighborhood. And I think you talked about this in your book regarding ethnic cleansing. Now, I was wondering, do you have a take at all on segregation?
Well, I have a take on it. It was a system in the South, okay, that was imposed after first the South lost the war. Then they had Reconstruction imposed on them. Then they had their redemption, and they drove the federal troops out, and they imposed this system of segregation on the South. And then it got used as a justification for the Jewish war on the South, known as the Civil Rights Movement. And what happened after that is that war was so successful in the South, they decided to move it up north. And so they brought Martin Luther King into Chicago to end segregation in Chicago. There was no segregation in Chicago. It was ethnic neighborhoods, and this was the target. And so segregation got used as part of the whole war on ethnicity that I described in my book, The Slaughter of Cities, Urban Renewal as Ethnic Cleansing.
So would you support going back to a system that would include segregation?
No, it's a stupid system. It didn't work. It failed. You can never go back anyway. You cannot go back. So it's not. No, I'm not in favor of that system. And I couldn't bring it back even if I wanted to.
That's definitely fair.
And on top of that, I think that the people in the South could have resolved that on their own if they had been left alone.
Well, I mean, it did. You realize, I mean, it failed not because of its own dictates of its own policy, but because the federal government used force to dissolve the policy which was favored by the populations of the South. I mean, it wasn't put to a democratic vote. It was passed by executive
No,
order,
no,
of
it was
course.
destroyed by the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement was a manifestation of the Black Jewish Alliance that began in with the lynching of Leo Frank. This was the Jewish revenge against the South for the lynching of Leo Frank. But it was the culmination of basically 70 years of Jews trying to turn Negroes into revolutionaries in the South. That's what it was, and they succeeded because I think the system was vulnerable. You can say, okay, if the federal government, if the civil rights movement destroyed it, it didn't fail; it was destroyed. But I think it would have failed, or I think it would have changed over time into something where the people would have learned how to live with each other in a better fashion than that was.
Well, thank you very much for elaborating on that as well. Paddockberg, did you by chance have any questions that you would like to further ask Dr. Jones?
Oh no. One in terms of what I was talking about before, referring to the demographic makeup of the Catholic Church worldwide. Now, where do you see the European population percentage-wise, let's say in the next 200 years, considering the steep decline in the European makeup of the Catholic world population?
What do I see happening in Europe?
What do you see in terms of the percentage of Europeans in comprising the Catholic Church worldwide, in terms of the demographic makeup, considering the fact that it has, in the last century, gone down from about 70% to about 20%, and seems to be
I
falling
think.
drastically still.
Look, there are a lot of people in Africa, and the missionary efforts really didn't start until the 20th century. So obviously, it's going to spread, and there will be a lot of Africans who convert to Catholicism. So obviously, you're going to have a higher percentage of Africans in the church than you did in 1900. That's
Do you
obvious.
think this is a wise policy for the church to basically turn its back on the people that founded it and brought it into prominence as a cohesive means to adhere the European people together under a unified cultural banner?
It's not a question of turning their back on the people who founded it. I don't think that's an accurate presentation of what.
Well. Here's how I'll put it. The Pope, the leader of the Church, the Vicar of Christ on earth, is advocating for the massive influx and the open borders of every European nation, while at the same time the Church's missionary work is being done almost exclusively in the Third World. Now, this doesn't seem at odds with the obvious want for European nationalism that is rising right now. You think this is kind of a symptomatic response to?
I think the immigration is causing the rise in nationalism. I think that's right.
And the church is promoting it. And do you think this is a problem?
I don't think the church is promoting it. I think the Jews are promoting it. I think the church is in a situation like the church is in the situation. I would say even here, I'm not sure that the Pope is promoting the immigration.
He is. I can bring up a bevy of
quotes. I understand what you're saying. I think he's saying that the church is in a situation here where people show up. This is in the United States as well. People show up here, and what are we going to do?
Well, it's not that people showing up. It's that they're being invited in. It's that they're being invited in. And the establishment of the church at the highest level of echelon, at the highest echelon of power in the Vatican, is advocating for the open borders in terms of every Western nation, and they're advocating for exactly what is leading to the European decline in demographics in their church.
I don't think that's what he's saying. I'm not trying to defend what he's saying, but I don't think that's what he's saying.
But he said it is incumbent upon the Western world, the Western people, to actually give and share of their resources materially and humanly, he says, with the needy and disadvantaged people who are coming into their country based on their own government's policy of inviting them in, not based on a democratic consensus or their want for it.
The church cannot do this. Only a government can do this. And if you're asking who the government official responsible for it is in Germany, it's Angela Merkel. It's not
What is the Vatican's personal policy when it comes to immigration?
helping people who are refugees.
What about within the borders of the Vatican?
You mean, why isn't the Vatican letting in more refugees?
Yeah, if this is their express policy that Western European nations should
Because
do
the
this.
Vatican is the Vatican state is about the size of a medium-sized Walmart parking lot. So there's not simply enough room for anybody.
So is the state of Rhode Island, and guess what? Rhode Island is now inundated with thousands of Somalian and third world refugees, specifically from Africa and the Middle East.
If you're asking me whether it's the church that's causing this, I'm saying no. It's the government. The church has no power to do anything in this regard.
But the church doesn't have influence in its advocacy when it comes to their.
The church is saying, if their people are coming in, yeah, you should share your wealth with them. You should treat them as you would like to be treated yourself if you were in a similar situation. I can understand that. The point here is it's only a government can control the borders, and the people who are responsible for the lack of control on the borders are the governments, not the church. Church can't control anybody's border.
Well, that's
thank you for that illuminating answer. Appreciate that.
Yep, and thank you very much for that exchange as well. That was very interesting. Now, Dr. Jones, I was wondering by chance, there has been some sort of heated debate in the past month or so regarding automation. There was an exchange, I'm not sure if you're familiar with, between one Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson regarding automation. Do you by chance have a take on that?
On automation, I didn't see that exchange, but I do have a take on automation.
Yes, yeah. Yes, sir.
I mean, the labor is the source of all value. Okay, that is the simple fact of economic life. John Locke said it, Adam Smith said it, Karl Marx said it, and Pope John Paul II said it. They are all over the political spectrum, but I think everyone agrees that labor is the source of value. One of the things that labor can why is that? Because labor creates surplus value. So if you have a pound of flour, it's not going to be worth as much as a loaf of bread. Okay, what's the difference between a pound of flour and a loaf of bread? Human labor. Human labor has increased the value of this, whatever it was at the beginning. Now, that surplus value the increase in surplus value should be reflected in wages, in the productivity of the worker. That and this also goes for tools. Okay, tools magnify labor, but no tool can exist without human labor. Human labor creates tools. So there's no such thing as automation replacing human beings. Okay, what you're seeing are sophisticated tools and who add to the productivity, but the worker should share in the increase in productivity and not simply the owner of the tool. Now, what we had over the course, beginning with the Volcker head of the Fed, we had a massive assault on the manufacturing base of the United States of America, a massive assault on the notion that wages should be to support a man and his family. That was combined with feminism to destroy the man's ability to support a family. And as a result, we have devastated our own manufacturing productive capacity. The people of Indiana, I was there when Trump came, they woke up to this fact. They were being screwed by outsourcing. The biggest rise he got out of the audience was attacking Carrier Air Conditioning for moving its plant to Mexico. Let's bring this back to the basic issue that we're talking about here. Why do we have borders? We have borders to protect the people of the country, of the United States of America. Protect them against what? The main thing we need borders to protect the worker against is unfair competition, which means flooding this labor market with people who are willing to work for less than the people who are working here for. That is one of the reasons why we need to protect our borders. That was one of the reasons why Trump got elected. This is part of the teaching of the Catholic Church. If you go and look at something like Heinrich Pesch and his understanding of the nation state, everything that takes place has to take place within these realities. And
If I can interject here,
yeah,
I would like to ask you about this that might be at odds in terms of church policy with what you're saying.
right.
Now, the Catholic Church and Catholic charities in this country are actively giving tremendous amounts of money to refugees to come into this country. They are basically incentivizing, along with the government as well, the programs to invite refugees in this country and to give them charity and handouts once they get here. Now, you don't think this is something that would, I don't know, go against the whole idea of having integrity when it comes to borders and determination of your own demographics and your own nations?
First of all, I don't know whether Catholic Charities is incentivizing people to come here.
They're giving out money for
I know that.
refugees
I know
to stay here.
that's
That's
what charity is.
incentivizing.
Charity is when you're here and you need money, we'll give you some money. That is a basic act of charity. There's nothing wrong with that. The main group of people who are incentivizing open borders are the oligarchs, the employers, because they are the ones who benefit from driving wages down. The people, the average person in the pew does not benefit when there's all this competition for wages and the wages go down. So I'm saying I don't see the church incentivizing this. I see them taking care of people who are in bad straits when they're already here.
If we could just go back to the automation question for one moment, that interview between Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson, the example that was used was Tesla right now is developing trucks that will be able to drive themselves. Now, I believe it's one of the biggest professions in this country is truck driving.
Right.
And the point that Tucker Carlson made was if you phase out 10 million jobs in a matter of years for the truck drivers, that it would obviously affect more than just the 10 million people that are now out of work. It would also affect their families.
Right.
So going back to what you said about that no tool can completely replace labor, in that sense, would those trucks being driven automatically not replace all the labor?
Yeah. Look, first of all, trucks as the way of moving goods across the interstate highway system is a new invention anyway. It was as I just said, it was the result of the interstate highway system, and the Teamsters Union got behind it, and they made out very well by driving all these trucks. Is that the best way to move goods across the country? I don't think so. I don't think so. It's the way we have it now. The problem here is how do you balance off the good of the wage and the good of the worker with some type of technological advance? How do you balance that out? Now, the libertarians always say, "Oh, it doesn't matter because then they'll all get jobs and they'll all become professors in gender studies programs and it'll all work out in the end." It doesn't work that out, and there are short-term dislocations that are going to take place, and this may be one of them. I'm not sure. I mean, it sounds that way. It sounds as if there's going to be this kind of dislocation, but the point is that this didn't exist always anyway, and maybe it's not the best way to do it, and maybe there are other ways that these people can earn money. I can't adjudicate that. That's not something I can adjudicate. And in a sense, it's not something that the church says it's got to adjudicate either. The church adjudicates it by the wage. Okay, the wage has to be of a certain level. You can't just allow people to drive wages down, either by unfair competition, by flooding the market with workers, or by any of the other means that drive that down. The main problem here is that people just don't earn enough money. Wages across the board are too low. That's the problem. So whether there are going to be short-term dislocations, that's always going to happen, and I don't know how you can avoid it.
Absolutely. And I know we've reached pretty much that half-hour mark. If you don't mind, would you mind answer one more question?
Sure.
Great. Okay. So I watched your interview that you did with Ryan Dawson. It was a great interview, by the way.
Right.
And you talked a lot about white identity in the sense of cultural identity, in the sense of like language in places like Europe. You know, the Germans, the French, and so on. But now in the United States, there is a common language, obviously English, and but you have a lot of European genes that have mixed together over the years. So, what identity would you think that they should hold on to, if not a sort of white identity?
White identity was created by the social engineers to destroy Catholic neighborhoods. Okay, I'm talking about that group of people in the North. The greatest triumph during this period was to convince some Irishman or some Polak or some Italian that he was white. And the way you did that was to drive him out of an ethnic neighborhood and move him into the suburb. That's the way you created that white identity, which was a bogus identity. I've always said it was a bogus identity. Now, in the South, it was different. It was a different situation. You didn't have a large Catholic population down in the South, and I guess white was an identity. But I'm saying even there, it's a negative identity because it's the opposite of black. And so someone just sent me a comment on that interview and sent me a quote by Cornel West, in which he said the same thing I said. You didn't know you were white until you came to the United States. Okay? And when you got here, that's not what your identity was anyway, according to the triple melting pot, which is the theory that I think explains ethnic identity in America. And that is basically after 3 generations, your ethnic identity is based on your religion. So it's Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. White is a negative term. White is the sign of absence. White is the sign that you lost your identity. Okay, it's Protestants who don't go to church. It's Italians who move to the suburbs. It's a bogus identity that was created by the social engineers to subjugate people.
Is Jewish identity a bogus identity?
No.
Why?
Well, I say it's the triple melting pot. I mean, because it conforms to the triple melting pot. Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. They are
Jew is a tribal identity. It is not a religious identity. Not exclusively at least, and you know that.
Yeah.
European identity is synonymous with white identity, and you know that too. I think you understand that white identity is just synonymous with European identity. We're getting to, I mean, it's just semantics.
There is no European identity.
There's no underlying identity within Europe.
No.
None. No underlying cultural sharing. No underlying biological.
Well, if you want to talk about the Catholic Church created Europe. It gave the foundation for European culture, so that these people, as I said, my barbarian Germanic ancestors could collaborate with each other instead of killing each other and looting and pillaging.
So why exactly is Jewish identity not bogus and European identity is bogus?
Well, if you want my honest opinion, I mean, there are plenty of Jews who claim that it's religion. I mean, they do claim it's a religion.
They also claim that Karl Marx was a Jew just as much as Benjamin Netanyahu is. Many of them do. Many of them understand that this is a tribal identity that trumps religion. It goes beyond religion. It transcends.
And I think that's true.
Religion.
I wrote the Jewish revolutionary spirit in part to try and solve this problem, because it's always like a shell game. You know, is it ethnic? Is it racial? Is it religious? Is it cultural? Well, it depends on what term gives them the advantage that they want at a particular time. So my definition is that it's a negative identity. It is like white in the sense that it's a negative identity, but it's anti-logos. It's rejection of logos. That's the essence of Jewish identity, and that's what unites people from the one extreme because of their association with the Talmud, all the way to the other extreme to people like Karl Marx, who rejected his Jewish identity, or Trotsky, who rejected his Jewish identity. It's rebellion against logos. I think that's what they have in common, and that's the thesis of the Jewish revolutionary spirit.
Now, why is there such an attack on European identitarianism as opposed to the lack of mainstream attack on Jewish identitarianism?
Because the Jews have the upper hand now. I mean, what you're seeing in places like Hungary, Poland, is an attack on Hungarian identity. Now that's a real identity because it's based on language, and ethnos is always based on language. That is a real cultural identity. It's been in existence for 1,000 years, and it's under attack. And the main man who's promoting the attack is George Soros. Because the Jews never feel comfortable, because they're always a minority in any culture where they live, and they only feel comfortable if they're undermining the majority culture. They've done this always, but now we've got, they have the upper hand. They have a lot of power that they didn't have before, and they're using this power to destroy the cultures, the cultures in Europe. And
would you not agree that that power is derived from their intensely racially tribal nature, and at the expense of the racial tribal nature of European people, that they see as a threat to their dominance over every aspect of the Western culture?
Is there a strain of racism among the Jews? Of course there is. It goes all the way back to the Gospel of St. John, where they said they were the seed of Abraham and disagreed with Jesus Christ. Of course there is. There's an element of racism. The Jews invented racism. Of course there is. Okay?
Racism, well, the Jews didn't invent racism. People are naturally racist. Would you not agree? They have an in-group preference that is obvious.
I wouldn't call that racism.
Well, that's what that's what the Jews have.
What I'm referring to is their claim that they have some type of biological superiority.
Oh, no. That aside, I mean, we're not talking about superiority. We're just talking about an intensely tribal nature that gives them an advantage as a group that is cohesive. Now, the European people, regardless of whether you think there's a unity within the whole of Europe or within particular European nations, are being denied that kind of cohesive unity that comes with a racial consciousness by the Jews that are controlling the culture and the media and the educational system and the saying that European people that it's a bogus identity to identify yourself as a European person, when the Jews have used their Jewish identity to become a tribal entity which has been able to monopolize power and profit in such a way through this mechanism of their own adherence to their own tribal identity. Now, wouldn't you say that it is a detriment to the European people that they aren't adhering as strictly to this tribal identity as the Jews are?
I had this discussion in Germany with friends. There were 6 of us. The only language we had in common was German. We had to talk German because that was the only language we had in common. And the lady who was the hostess said, "Ich bin kein Deutscher, ich bin Europäer." I'm not a German, I'm a European. And I said to her, "Well, then tell me how you say, where is the train station in European?" Well, she didn't know what to say at that point. You can't be a European unless you're a German. So there is a German identity. There's a German ethnic identity, okay, that is under attack. There's no question. I just told you that the Allied forces created a whole program of social engineering to destroy ethnic solidarity among the Germans. That's true. But the German identity is not racial. It's not racial. That was Hitler's idea, and Hitler got the idea from Madison Grant. That is not the basis of German culture. It's not the basis of any culture that I know.
It's the basis of Jewish culture, is it not?
I've already said that the Jews are basically an ideological formation.
But they're a tribal formation. That's not true. They're not bound together by a common ideology. They're bound together by a tribal affiliation.
You can have a racial ideology. There's no question about it. And the Jews have one. There's no question.
It's not an ideology. It's not a mere ideology. It goes beyond ideology. It goes beyond religion. It's a tribal basis for forming a group that has the interest of each other in mind, regardless of the little differentiations
I don't know what you mean. You keep saying tribal basis. Tribe is a word. It's the same word as ethnos. It means ethnic group.
Yes.
Okay. If you're saying that it's an ethnic group, okay, I can understand that. There's no biological continuity between the Jews who crucified Jesus Christ and the Ashkenazi now. It doesn't. That Shlomo Sand exploded that myth that these people are not Semites. The Ashkenazi are a Turkic race. We know that from the Genome Project. So if you're talking about there is no biological continuity here. The only continuity the Jewish people have, is ideological. That's my point. And there may be an ideology of race here that's at work. That's true, but it's an ideology. There is no biological basis for anything here.
Thank you for that. Appreciate the answer.
All right, yeah, and thank you again, Dr. Jones, for staying well over time. We do appreciate that, and it was a very interesting discussion indeed.
It was. I enjoyed the discussion. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on. Would you like to plug your most recent projects?
Well, I'm doing a book on Logos, as the history of Logos and the Logos of history. I just mentioned the fact that I just did a chapter in the book which called Werner Heisenberg and Jewish Science, which will appear in the January issue of Culture Wars magazine. So if you want to get the book as it's appearing in articles, I would ask you to subscribe to Culture Wars magazine and become part of this discussion. That is the gist of what I'm doing right now, and I was happy I had the chance to discuss it with you tonight.
Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Jones.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jones, for coming on. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the evening.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.
Gute Nacht.
So long.
Gute Nacht. Schlaf gut.
Ja, machen Sie es auch gut.